Welcome to our third show. I have to say we've been absolutely overwhelmed with all of your positive feedback, and one of my favourite comments from Twitter was that in just our first hour we'd come up with better journalism than the BBC has in the last 10 years. Shock. Which brings me to a story that is truly horrific catalogue of child abuse and subsequent cover-ups on the island of Jersey. Honestly, this is the kind of stuff was going on a Hollywood movie. You still would not believe it. Now, when you think of Jersey, you might think of sun, sand, sea, Bergerac, various other things. It's supposed to be a beautiful island, apparently. But we've been hearing some really awful things about it. Now, let me just give you a little bit of history. As a journalist, I was very aware in about 2008 that there was a significant investigation taking place on Jersey. I was also very aware that the police chief at the centre of it, Lenny Harper, was experiencing something of a smear campaign against him. That became very apparent to me in a very short period of time. But tonight we're joined by a number of people who will give us a greater awareness of what has been going on and what continues to go on Jersey. First of all, I'd like to welcome in somebody who's perhaps the most qualified person to tell us about the police corruption, the political interference, the cover-up and the full horror of abuse that went on in the children's care home scandal centred on Haute de la Garenne, and that is former Deputy Chief Officer of Jersey, Lenny Harper. Hello Lenny, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, good evening.
So Lenny, obviously we've got you on here to tell us, you know, about your experiences of what was taking place on Jersey, what continues to take place. You were in charge of Operation Rectangle.
Yes, I was, yes, from the very outset.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, what happened was that one of the police legal advisors and myself had become increasingly concerned about the difficulties that the police were having and that the prosecution services were having in convicting people of abuse just because it had happened some years before. And we started digging into old cases, and we started to unearth some disturbing facts about allegations that had been made about abuse in care homes run by the Jersey government. But in almost all cases, these appeared to have been curtailed at very early stages, sometimes involving rather dubious behaviour by police officers and prosecutors, and in all cases where it seemed to be that the victims of the abuse were actually being treated more harshly than those who committed the abuse.
Right. I mean, we're hearing that from a number of people, including yourself. We will have later on the show Trevor and Shona Pittman, who were obviously on the island. John Hemming, the MP, will be joining us as well. But you were subjected to the most horrendous smears, weren't you, Lenny?
Yes, I was, right from the very outset. My relationship with the Jersey government had been a little bit strained because of a number of ongoing issues from very early on in my tenure there, involving horrendous firearms that were kept on the island, powerful firearms which nobody bothered to get licenses for, and then later on police corruption, which we found to be almost an impossible issue to try and get prosecutions from. My relationships with the Attorney General, for instance, broke down very badly when one particularly bad case of police corruption was refused a prosecution by him, and I then charged the police officer with a number of less serious offences which didn't need the Attorney General's authority. So by the time the child abuse case started, I'd already made enemies of a number of politicians and corrupt police officers who then ganged together. And the first signs of the smear campaign were letters delivered to a lot of the national newspapers in London accusing myself of being an abuser, and that was a foretaste of things to come. Followed very quickly by a particular politician on the island who had links to some of these corrupt police officers, then comparing me to Lenny Henry.
Right, I see. Okay, but you know, some of the stats that we've been coming up with, just tell me if we've got it right here. 192 victims and 151 abusers were identified, but only 7 people were successfully prosecuted.
Yes, that is correct. When I left the island in 2008, we had a priority list of 12 suspects, all of whom I believed and still believe that we had enough evidence to charge. Now, none of those, well, one of them had been charged. One of them had been charged by the time I left the island, again, he'd only been charged because we'd been given the go-ahead to charge by the legal advisor, but at the very last moment, in a reflection of what had happened during some of the police corruption cases, the Attorney General instructed us not to charge. Now, unfortunately, there was a misunderstanding, and the message didn't actually get to me, and we went ahead and charged him. But when I left the island, he was the only one who had been charged. Some of the people that we'd been refused permission to charge were later charged on the same evidence when the pressure was building on the authorities.
Right. Now, one of the things that stood out to me the most about your investigation was the finding of remains at Haute de la Graine, which have subsequently been dismissed as a coconut. I mean, tell me your feelings about all of that, would you?
Well, there's absolutely no question but that the Jersey media and others lied in respect of the alleged coconut, which we knew as jar 6, which was the exhibit number for it. It was found by the anthropologists and archaeologists who were working away, and the anthropologist was a lady by the name of Julie Roberts, who gave evidence not so long ago in a very, very highly publicised case down in Wales. The little girl whose name escapes me now at the moment, who went missing and whose remains were never properly found. There were some burnt bones found in the fire, and Julie Roberts gave evidence in that case. Well, she was the anthropologist who originally identified the piece of what she said was a child's skull. Now that was sent off, and as the weeks and weeks went on, it became clear from the digging that the archaeologists were carrying out that in actual fact it was probably a bit old to fit the parameters of our investigation. However, the laboratory that were examining it found traces of collagen in the item, and collagen, a quick lesson here, collagen is only found in mammals, including humans. Now, the laboratory then, for some reason, unethically and totally illegally, started sending this out to other people to examine it without keeping a proper record of where it was going and who it was going to. And apparently a throwaway remark by a technician in one of these places who wasn't qualified that it looked a bit like a coconut was taken up by the authorities in Jersey and used as a stick to beat us. Now, when the item came back to the police lab, back to the police store, the anthropologist Julie Russell looked at it, or Julie Roberts looked at it, and stated that it had changed colour, texture and weight since she had last seen it. So now, without further analysis, she couldn't be sure that it was actually a piece of human skull. Right. Now, she was misquoted, and my successors then gave a very, very now infamous press conference in which they, among other things, said that Julie Roberts had now changed her mind and said that this piece of skull... Yeah, and of course, Julie Roberts had actually said no such thing, and I furnished documentation from Julie Roberts' log to show that she had said no such thing, but it was just willfully ignored. Right. I mean, amongst the other things that they said, and which was perhaps even more damning and perhaps more significant, was that there were no cellars at Haute de la Graine, just floor voids. And they said, in a deliberate attempt to smear, not so much myself, including myself, but more so the victims of the abuse, they said that the 30 victims who had claimed to have been assaulted in the cellars at Haute de la Graine must have been telling lies, because there were no cellars, only voids. Right. Several people actually have demolished that, because, I mean, I know for a fact that there were areas which were between 5 and 7 feet high, and indeed Panorama filmed in one of those areas, as did Bob Hill, a Jersey politician. But not only that, I actually took a number of politicians in Jersey around those cellars, including the then Chief Minister Frank Walker and his wife, the then Home Affairs Minister Andrew Lewis, and both of them saw the work going on in these cellars. Both of them knew that these cellars were in some places 7 feet high, and yet both of them later on supported my successor in saying that there were no cellars, just floor voids. So it's quite clear that the Jersey media and the Jersey authorities lied in respect of not only about the item that you mentioned earlier, the piece of Stalin, and that's not even mentioning the other bones that we found, which an anthropologist in Sheffield said were fresh and fleshed, and I quote him, they were fresh and fleshed when they were buried. And the archaeologist who said that these bones that we found had been covered up in an obvious deliberate act of concealment, and it must have been done in the late 60s, early 70s. So, when you look at things like that, which were revealed and are still there to be seen on a couple of blogs in Jersey, that you can see that the Jersey authorities and the Jersey media, who are greatly influenced and pressurised by the Jersey government, they just simply lied about it.
So during the investigation, am I right in saying that you felt pressure to step back, to not come so close to finding some truths?
Well, that happened, and it started right at the very outset when we went public with the inquiry. I mean, if you imagine this happening in the UK, yeah. I, as the Deputy Chief of Police, was summoned to the Chief Minister's office, and in there was the Chief Minister and the head of the Civil Service. And I got an awful rollicking for going public on the investigation. I was then ordered to pull back, and I was told that I could bring the government down if I didn't desist.
Wow.
And my answer to that was, look, that's not my concern, that's your concern.
Absolutely.
This is a police investigation. He then ordered me to stop referring to the victims as victims, and said that they couldn't be victims as nobody had yet been convicted.
Right.
And unknown to me at the time, the Attorney General was telling his senior lawyers that nobody would ever be convicted.
Right.
So, I refused, and from that moment on, it is quite clear and as well documented that there was a conspiracy then amongst the Deputy Home Affairs Minister. I must add, when I refer to the Home Affairs Minister, my original Home Affairs Minister, who was a lady by the name of Wendy Kinnard, was very, very supportive of the investigation, and at some cost to herself. And
in terms of what happened to her?
Well, she eventually was driven out of office. She was threatened, and she was... I sat at a meeting one day with her where one of the politicians I mentioned earlier told her that she only got the job because she was a little girly and that she should pull back.
Well, it's really interesting because I have a document here which substantiates so much of what you've said, and this was by a former colleague of yours who actually, I can't unfortunately show it to people, not fully, but I can show it obviously without a close-up because we can't reveal names and various things, but it totally validates what you're saying about the sort of level of obstructions that took place from within the establishment at any attempt to uncover abuse.
Well, I mean, absolutely. I mean, and it went to the very top. Another example was when the investigation was well underway, and the Attorney General's office did not like the way that I was carrying out the investigation, and we had allegations against a number of senior people in the children's service and the caring professions in Jersey, so much so that I couldn't use any of them. The victims didn't trust them. But the Attorney General tried to force me into having what he called an independent child abuse specialist lawyer from the United Kingdom placed in my incident room, where he would be able to look at all my intelligence and information coming in at a very early stage. Now, I fought against this, and it transpired later on that not only was the lawyer that the Attorney General wanted to place in the office not a specialist child abuse lawyer, although there was somebody in his chambers who did have some experience in child abuse, but he was also a member of the chambers that had earned millions and millions of pounds from the Attorney General's office in Jersey by doing financial crime work.
Right.
And he came from the chambers that the Attorney General had very close connections to.
Right.
So this obstruction was going on continually throughout, and a number of politicians in Jersey gave statements to various people saying that they had overheard the Chief Minister ordering the Home Affairs Minister to sack me and get rid of me. And Graham Power, my Chief Constable, was ordered several times to try and suspend me or get rid of me. That involved a couple called the Maguires. Now, I'll paraphrase it very quickly because it's a horrible, long, drawn-out story, but the Maguires were in charge of a Jersey care home in the 1980s and 90s, and in the 1990s a number of children made allegations of sexual and physical abuse against them. Now, eventually they were arrested and charged, but for some reason, no questions about the sexual offences were ever put to them. And they were eventually charged with some physical abuse. During the proceedings, the committal proceedings to begin with, the magistrate was so horrified he refused to hear at the lower court and committed them to the higher court. Then a member of the Jersey caring profession came forward and said that she had reported abuse by these people as early back as the early 1990s. However, the case was mysteriously withdrawn because apparently Mr. McGuire was terminally ill and expected to die soon. Now, he then left for France, and 10 years later, whenever we opened our inquiry again and we started re-interviewing victims, we were astonished to find that there were allegations of sexual abuse against them because there was not a trace of any allegations of sexual abuse in the records. With the help of Panorama, we tracked the Maguires down to France, and he was still in rude health 10 years after.
Right.
And we then tried... Oh, yeah, absolutely. We tried then to get him extradited. I was told by one of the senior lawyers on the case that we were a day and a half away from getting the indictments drawn up. Then the Attorney General objected to some procedural matters. I was then told it would take weeks to get advice from the CPS. I rang the CPS that afternoon and spoke to the senior person at the CPS in London in charge of extradition, got the information that we needed and passed it on within about half an hour. And it was just continually, from that aspect right back to the very start of the inquiry, where we were trying to get files from the Children's Service and they kept refusing us. In October 2007, I think we asked for 7 files of former residents at Hope de Lagarde who had made allegations of sexual and physical abuse. We were refused the files, and we found out then that the files were being hidden at Overdale Hospital because a member of staff came down and told us that she'd been forced to take the files and hide them. Right. So I went about the middle of November and saw the head of the Health and Social Services at that time, and I disclosed all that we had, including the fact that one of his senior personnel was involved in sexual abuse of boys. Now that man wasn't suspended, but I told him that we needed the files urgently. We did eventually get the files, but there were huge chunks missing from them. So yes, the obstruction was going on right from day one.
But the picture you paint really is of this sort of fiefdom where they rule themselves. There's like this self-governance, even though they are answerable, obviously, to the UK government. It's a mini rogue state, clearly, according to the picture that you're painting. They're answerable to nobody. The media are in cahoots with them. All of these establishment departments, I mean, it's like paedophile rings. I mean, it just sounds an absolute nightmare, Lenny. I mean, what can we do as people who want justice for the children at Hope de Lagarde? What can we do?
Well, the only thing that we can do, and it's the thing that saved my job very early on and saved the investigation from being buried yet again, is to try and get it to a wider audience. I mean, there are a few very, very brave people in Jersey who are trying to get the message out. There are a couple of blogs, the Voice for Children blog, there's a Rico Sorda blog, Stuart Sivery, the Jersey politician who was doing a lot of work on behalf of the child abuse victims, who has had his career and his personal life wrecked by these people, and the list goes on. Anybody who stands up to the government and doesn't do what they want, they are absolutely trashed. I mean, I think you either have or you're about to interview another couple, Trevor Pittman and his wife, Shona. Now, I never knew Trevor Pittman. I knew of him. I never knew him. He was not one of the politicians that I came into contact with during my time in Jersey, simply because he, as far as I knew, he had never transgressed any of the sort of anti-corruption activity that I was looking at. But Trevor was a politician who, as far as I could see, really never had any serious problems with the Jersey government. He disagreed with a lot of them, but they weren't hunting him until he chaired a scrutiny panel which was looking at a totally false report that had been carried out on the financial management that I had carried out on the abuse inquiry, in which I was criticised without ever being told that the inquiry was being held and without ever being spoken to about it, and a lot of the evidence being ignored. Now, Trevor reported honestly on that as he saw it, and absolutely criticised the report and criticised the government for what appeared to be a deliberate policy to try and hang myself and others out to dry. Now, since that day, Trevor Pittman has been mercilessly hounded by the Jersey government. He will no doubt, him and Shona will no doubt give you further details of that. But I have become very, very aware that exactly what happened to me is happening to them. And they're in a much worse position than I am, because I'm sitting over here in the United Kingdom. You know, they're at home facing this, they're back in Jersey facing this every day. But anybody who stands up to them is just mercilessly hunted. And it's happening now to the Pittmans. And I think it's only by getting it out into a wider audience that pressure will be brought to bear and that justice will be sought, because the victims are not getting justice now at the moment.
No, and what we're also hearing is that sort of their records in terms of verifying that they were even at Haute de la Garenne in the first place have disappeared, vanished. I mean, this is a recurring theme that we're getting, is that sort of all records pertaining to anybody who was associated with the place, they no longer exist. And it's so widespread and endemic, it's really quite shocking. But for you, you know, because obviously, you know, you must hear many awful, horrendous things about police corruption, and you were there, and you were trying to do the right thing, a sort of good cop in an awful situation. And I mean, how did that make you, the sort of fallout for you? How did that actually make you feel? Did you just think there is no point trying to tackle these establishments because they all, you know, they mass together and they come out strong against you?
Well, that was the problem. I mean, I should emphasise that the vast majority of police officers in Jersey were honest and hard-working. In fact, I'm very proud of the fact, and they should be very proud of the fact, that in all our corruption inquiries, I never brought any officers in from outside. I had very young detectives working undercover, investigating corrupt police officers. We were finding them engaged in importation of cannabis. We were finding them engaged selling secrets for sex. It was a dire but small number. There was another case where we uncovered a corrupt ring of cops who were furnishing a towing contractor with so much work that the other contractors in the island were being put out of business. And we had to actually, there was about 10% of the force who admitted eventually, when we offered an amnesty, admitted to having had wrongful dealings with this man. But the politicians and the corrupt cops ganged together to try and block us at every move. And there was one famous quote which was given by a politician whose son branded me as Lenny Henry, who said that I misunderstood the Jersey culture, that a little bit of corruption never did anybody any harm. And that was the sort of thing that we were facing. We were called, I think the Jersey Evening Post called us the politically correct KGB stalking the corridors of police headquarters.
Well, we've had our communication with the Jersey Post today, which I'll talk about a little bit later when we come to the Pittmans. But Lenny, thank you so much for joining me. It's been really insightful. You know, it's really important and that people are prepared to stand up and be counted. You clearly were. Thank you so much. You know, people will appreciate this in time to come. I know they already have anyway, because, you know, people do speak about you with a great deal of respect, because you did put your neck on the line, which is a wonderful thing to do. So thank you so much, Lenny. I hope to speak to you at some stage in the future.